Let me just close with a few thoughts by way of conclusion on the historiography of loyalism and why I think we need to attend to this story now. Now, around the time that Johnston wrote up her memoirs, a young man from New Hampshire moved to Eastport, Maine to start editing a newspaper. His name was Lorenzo Sabine, and in his career he had many hats that he wore. He was a teacher, he was a clerk, he was a merchant, he was an editor, he was a justice of the peace, he was even briefly a member of Congress. But the thing that kept him going, the thing that he was passionate about throughout his life, was the history of the American Revolution, a history that had unfolded in the generation before his and that he grew up hearing about. And in Eastport, Maine, as he put it, on the eastern frontier of the Union, he found that, quote, the graves and the children of the Loyalists are around me in every direction. But he also found that he had never heard anything about them. This was the 1830s, 1840s. Here were all these people from the era that he knew best, his father's generation, and he knew nothing about them. So he started to dig into their lives, making journeys, as he put it, to confer with the living, pilgrimages to graveyards. He gathered notes and scraps and combed through state papers, tracing names painstakingly from one generation to the next. And he brought all of this research together in a publication called Biographical Sketches of the Loyalists of the American Revolution. It's an encyclopedic compendium of hundreds of Loyalist lives that is a touchstone for researchers even today. Sabine gets written off as an antiquarian. But I think several elements in his presentation actually stand out as very fresh today. He uses biography to tell big stories, something that many, many historians are now doing. He emphasizes the violence of this Civil War, something that I think we also could do well to recall. And he appreciated the flexibility of political identities. And this comes back to my point about ideals. As he put it, to change from one side to another was not uncommon. And I've been struck with the absence of fixed principles, not only among common people in the common walks of life, but in many of the prominent personages of the day. He did not see the revolution as a clear-cut conflict between tyranny and democracy, as some of his peers were wont to do. Instead, he had a more flexible and I think less judgmental view of the Loyalists. So it's worth hearing that voice, a voice closer to the events themselves, because it tells us something about how people who knew this event best recognized it. It tells us first something about internationalism. It makes us revisit America's historical place in the world. The history of the American Revolution has tended to encourage a sense of American exceptionalism, and for some really, really good reasons rooted in our founding principles. But the history of Loyalists shows us that for all the things that make America very distinctive and great, America's history has always been intertwined with that of other regions. The Americans who went to Canada, Jamaica, Sierra Leone, India, Australia, these were Americans, and they brought with them aspects of American culture and American ideas, and fitted into an ongoing British sphere. It tells us something about nationalism. I think it makes us revisit some of the nationalist stereotypes about the meaning of liberty, about even the meaning of being an American. Historiography has always been a sort of national pursuit. The professional discipline of history actually sort of emerged in the period in which nation states were getting formed. But an international history of the American Revolution, an international history like that of the Loyalist diaspora, I think corrects sometimes the insular understandings that can emerge, or misunderstandings. The US historiography of loyalism that portrays them as the Tories, as the losers, as members of a very particular social class, fits in, I think, to a tradition, a somewhat insidious tradition, of writing off certain kinds of dissenters as un-American. But what we can see rather, I think, is that these people were multi-ethnic, they were multi-faith, they were politically diverse, and within America they were testaments to the plurality of what it has always meant to be an American. And outside America, arguably, if you follow those sort of surprisingly revolutionary loyalists, you can even see these people as progenitors of a certain strand of imperial dissent as much as embodiments of a type of imperial consent. Final point has to do with partisanship. When Lorenzo Sabine published a second edition of his book, 17 years later, he said he hoped that his history of Loyalists had, quote, done something for the cause of human brotherhood by lessening the rancor, even the hate, which long existed between the children of the winners and the children of the expatriated losers in the Civil War which dismembered the British Empire, unquote. He wrote that in 1864, the middle of what we call the Civil War. And yet, as a critic in the New York Times marveled, quote, two conflicting parties arrayed against each other with the peculiar bitterness of internecine strife had already given way to a generation in which laborious investigations are taken into the history of those very Tories who affrighted our youth. And so at the time that this country was most bitterly divided, the Loyalists pointed a way to healing. We live now in a time of tremendous partisanship. I speak to you in the city in which I need not elaborate further. It reminds us, though, this history, the most of the Loyalists actually stayed. They were not killed in a bloodbath. It was actually reasonable for William Johnston to think that Elizabeth Johnston might find a decent future in New York City. So the story of the Loyalists, the ones who went, but also the ones who stayed, reminds us that even at our founding, we were a people of many ideas, deeply felt values, great divisions, but we were able to make one nation out of people who had just fought a civil war. So there isn't just one kind of freedom. There isn't just one way to pursue happiness. There isn't just one way to be an American. And I, for one, think that the more that we recognize this, the Loyalists can help us, the more that we can recognize diversity, the more perfect we make our union, and the more reasons we all have to remain loyal to it. Thank you.